So, as I said this morning, and if anyone needs to go out, then now is the time you can do that. But as I said this morning, we're going to look this evening at one of the most bizarre stories, I think you could say, in the whole Old Testament. It includes an enigmatic pagan prophet, an armed angel, and a talking Shrek-style donkey. Although this is a female donkey and not a male donkey. And that's just chapter 22, which we're going to look at tonight. Next time we'll focus more on chapters 23 and 24. And actually it's a story that gives us a unique perspective on Israel. Because in these chapters we see Israel from the perspective of their enemies. In a sense, up until this point in Numbers, we have been looking at Israel from the perspective of Israel. So we've been, as it were, inside the camp. But this evening we're going to think about Israel from outside the camp. What are their enemies thinking? What are their enemies doing? And that did make me wonder, how did Israel actually find out about the events that we're going to think about this evening? But clearly they did find out about them, because if they hadn't of, then we wouldn't have it in the Bible. So we're not quite sure how they found out about them, but we know that they must have, because it's recorded here for us. But at the time, they wouldn't have known that any of this was going on. And that just made me think that God's people all through history often don't know exactly what's happening outside the camp, if I can use that kind of analogy. We maybe know what's happening in our church, for example, but we don't know what's happening in some of the human institutions that we're subject to. We don't know what's happening certainly don't know what's happening in the heavenly realms. And yet I hope this story will give us a real sense of confidence and assurance that even though we might not know what's happening, God does know exactly what's happening and is sovereignly in charge and in control of all of those things. We serve a God who is sovereign and who is bending events to his will. And we'll find out tonight, but more next week, that God's sovereign will has always been and always will be to bless his people. So there are 7 scenes really in this drama over the next 2 weeks. We're going to look at the first 3 this evening, and that will take us to chapter 22, verse 35. This evening, I'm going to focus really on this mysterious character of Balaam. And then next time we'll focus much more on his prophetic oracles about Israel. So we'll focus more on the character of Balaam tonight, and then we'll focus next time on his oracles about Israel. So we're going to read. I'll read the whole passage, because sometimes with stories it's good to just read the whole thing and to enjoy the story. So we'll read from Numbers 22 and from verse 1 to 35. Then the people of Israel set out and camped in the plains of Moab beyond the Jordan at Jericho. And Balak the son of Ziphor saw all that Israel had done to the Amorites. And Moab was in great dread of the people, because they were many. Moab was overcome with fear of the people of Israel. And Moab said to the elders of Midian, "This horde will now lick us all up. Will now lick up all that is around us, as an ox licks up the grass of the field." So Balak the son of Zippor, who was the king of Moab at the time, sent messengers to Balaam the son of Beor at Pethor, which is near the river in the land of the people of Ammon, to call him, saying, "Behold, a people has come out of Egypt. They cover the face of the earth, and they are now dwelling opposite me. Come now, curse this people for me, since they are too mighty for me. Perhaps I shall be able to defeat them and drive them from the land. For I know that he whom you bless is blessed, and he whom you curse is cursed." So the elders of Moab and the elders of Midian departed with the fees for divination in their hands. And they came to Balaam and gave him Balak's message. And he said to them, "Lodge here tonight, and I will bring back word to you as the Lord speaks to me." So the princes of Moab stayed with Balaam. And God came to Balaam and said, "Who are these men with you?" And Balaam said to God, "Balak the son of Zippor, king of Moab, has sent to me, saying, Behold, a people has come out of Egypt, and it covers the face of the earth. Now come, curse them for me. Perhaps I should be able to fight them and drive them out." And God said to Balaam, "You shall not go with them. You shall not curse the people, for they are blessed." So Balaam rose in the morning and said to the princes of Balak, "Go to your own land, for the Lord has refused to let me go with you." So the princes of Moab rose and went to Balak and said, "Balaam refuses to come with us." Once again, Balak sent princes more in number and more honourable than these. And they came to Balaam and said to him, "Thus says Balak the son of Zippor, let nothing hinder you from coming to me, for I will surely do you great honour, and whatever you say to me I will do. Come, curse this people for me." But Balaam answered and said to the servants of Balak, "Though Balak were to give me his house full of silver and gold, I could not go beyond the command of the Lord my God, to do less or more. So you two, please stay here tonight, that I may know what more the Lord will say to me." And God came to Balaam that night and said to him, "If the men have come to call you, rise, go with them, but only do what I tell you." So Balaam rose in the morning and saddled his donkey and went with the princes of Moab. But God's anger was kindled because he went, and the angel of the Lord took his stand in the way as his adversary. Now he was riding on a donkey, and his two servants were with him. And the donkey saw the angel of the Lord standing in the road with a drawn sword in his hand. And the donkey turned aside out of the road and went into the field. And Balaam struck the donkey to turn her into the road. Then the angel of the Lord stood in a narrow path between the vineyards with a wall on either side. And when the donkey saw the angel of the Lord, she pushed against the wall and pressed Balaam's foot against the wall. So he struck her again. Then the angel of the Lord went ahead and stood in a narrow place where there was no way to turn, either to the right or to the left. When the donkey saw the angel of the Lord, she lay down under Balaam. And Balaam's anger was kindled, and he struck the donkey with his staff. Then the Lord opened the mouth of the donkey, and she said to Balaam, "What have I done to you, that you have struck me these 3 times? And Balaam said to the donkey, "Because you have made a fool of me. I wish I had a sword in my hand, then I will kill you." And the donkey said to Balaam, "Am I not your donkey, on which you have ridden all your life long to this day? Is it my habit to treat you this way?" And he said, "No." Then the Lord opened the eyes of Balaam, and he saw the angel of the Lord standing in the way with his drawn sword in his hand. And he bowed down and fell on his face. And the angel of the Lord said to him, "Why have you struck your donkey these 3 times? Behold, I have come out to oppose you, because your way is perverse before me. The donkey saw me and turned aside before me these 3 times. If she had not turned aside from me, surely just now I would have killed you and let her live." Then Balaam said to the angel of the Lord, "I have sinned, for I did not know that you stood in the road against me. Now, therefore, if it is evil in your sight, I will turn back." And the angel of the Lord said to Balaam, "Go with these men, but speak only the word that I tell you." So Balaam went on with the princes of Balak. So we're going to look at these 3 scenes. Really, scene 1 is verses 1 to 14. And it's Balak calling this man Balaam. Now, I think the background is important. Israel's exodus from Egypt had really shaken up the entire region. Just imagine that there's this new nation of numbering around maybe 2 million people just suddenly camping on your doorstep. They're in the wilderness, but they're looking for a home. God has, of course, given them the promised land. But I don't know. I couldn't find a place, but there may be somewhere that I'm not sure how widely known that was amongst the surrounding nations. Maybe there were some rumours that they were going into Canaan. We don't know exactly. But so even though God had given them the promised land, maybe some of these surrounding nations were very nervous and very worried with this whole new nation turning up on its borders. Now, we didn't look at this last time, but if you go back into the end of chapter 21, you'll see that Israel had asked the Amorites for a safe passage through their land, and their king, a man called Sihon, had refused and had attacked them. But Israel had defeated them, and they'd taken possession of their land. Then after that, you'll see that the brilliantly named Og, king of Bashan, had attacked them, and again Israel had prevailed and took possession of their land too. And now you see at the beginning of chapter 22, verse 1, Israel camps on the plains of Moab. And unsurprisingly, Balak, the king of Moab, is rather shaken up by this. Especially as just at the end of the last chapter, we're told that the Amorites had in the recent past defeated the Moabites. And now this new nation that had defeated the Amorites was camped on their doorstep. So he's kind of thinking, well, we've been defeated by them. This new nation has now come and they've defeated them. They must be really powerful. I'm really scared about this. And he has this brilliantly poetic kind of line in verse 4. This horde will now lick up all that is around us as the ox licks up the grass of the field. I don't know if you've ever seen that kind of thing, a cow, whatever, licking up the grass of the field. But anyway, that's the sort of analogy that Balak uses. He thinks he's done for. Now, Balak describes Israel as this horde, but perhaps another way of putting it is that Israel has become as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. This is evidence, isn't it, that God is starting to fulfill his promises to Abraham right in front of Balak. Well, what's Balak going to do? Well, for a pagan king, the answer is obvious. You call the local seer and you ask him to put a curse on your enemy. And so he calls this mysterious man called Balaam, the son of Beor, to do the job. And verse 7 tells us he offers him the fees for divination to do it. Now, we don't know much about Balaam or his background, but he's clearly a man of significant influence and power. Verse 6, Balak says to him, I know that he whom you bless is blessed, and he whom you curse is cursed. In fact, interestingly, there's an inscription which was found from the 8th century BC, which describes a man called Balaam as a seer of the gods. So clearly, he is someone who is seen in that area at that time as being someone who has a sort of a hotline to the gods. And the story leaves it very vague what Balaam's actual relationship with God is. He seems to have some kind of relationship with God, because all through the account he's communicating with God, he's speaking to God and God's speaking to him. And yet there's something that doesn't quite add up. Even though Balaam refers to the Lord, my God, verse 18, unusually in this section, the narrator doesn't use God's covenant name, Yahweh, the Lord. He simply refers to God as God in all of his interactions with Balaam. So if you look at verses 9, verse 10, verse 12, you'll see that. I think that's an indication that Balaam certainly isn't in covenant relationship with God as Israel is. And Balaam, through this narrative, does lots of things that the law would forbid. Now, we've got to be careful because the law has only just been given. But even so, Balaam is doing all kinds of things. Verse 7 indicates that he does divination. Later in chapter 24, verse 1, we're told that this time Balaam didn't look for omens, indicating that the other times he looked for omens. So we don't know exactly what Balaam is doing here, but he's clearly engaging in some kind of pagan practice rather than approaching God in the way that he had said he should be approached in the law he'd now given. Now, obviously we live in very different days, but it's just a reminder, isn't it, that God has given us a way to approach him. to Old Testament Israel that way was through the tabernacle, through sacrifice, through the priests. We can, as we're thinking this morning, approach him now through the Lord Jesus. And what Balaam's going to find is approaching God in other ways is going to end in disaster, just as it does for people who think they can approach God in any way they wish to now. Anyway, having said all of that, initially in verse 8, Balaam does exactly the right thing in response to Balak's requests. He says he's going to wait for God to speak to him, and then he obeys what God tells him to do. He tells these Moabite princes who have come to him that his hands are tied. The Lord has chosen to bless Israel, and therefore he can't put a curse on them. Again, that's an amazing encouragement, I think, isn't it? Those whom God has chosen to bless cannot be cursed. You know, we can think of that today as well, can't we? God has chosen to bless us as his people. If we are in Christ, there is nothing that the enemy could do that can ultimately touch us. Just reminded me as I was thinking about that of Romans 8. If God is for us, who can be against us? Nothing can separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord. Those whom God has chosen to bless cannot be cursed. Different context there, and then obviously, but it's the same principle. Now that should have been the end of the matter. But Balak, and presumably the evil spiritual forces who are behind Balak, aren't easily put off. So he sends word to Balaam again. And this is where scene 2 really starts in verse 15 of chapter 22. Verse 15. Balak knows he's got to pull out all the stops to persuade Balaam to come and help him. And so he does what often people do. He resorts to flattery. He sends even more noble princes. You see that, I think, verse 15 to 17. And he resorts to bribery. Whatever you say to me, I will do. What he's really saying is, I'll give you whatever you want. Just tell me what you want and I'll give it to you. Now, it's at this point that I think the story starts to get a little bit confusing. Because Balaam says he can't go beyond what the Lord will allow him to do. Even, he says, if Balak gives him his house full of silver and gold. Verse 18. Now, it's interesting that Balak hasn't mentioned a house full of silver and gold. But when Balak says, I'll do for you whatever you want, it seems that the first thing that pops into Balaam's mind is a house full of silver and gold. Anyway, we'll come back to that a little bit later. But then he says I can't do any more than God will allow me to do, but just stay the night anyway. In he talks about the fact that God might change his mind. He might have something more to tell me. When you think about it, that's a slightly strange thing for him to say, isn't it? God has already told him that it's his sovereign plan to bless this people. And now Balaam's kind of thinking, well, God might change his mind on that. Maybe if I ask him again, I might get a different answer. But why would God change such a fundamental plan to bless a people? Anyway, again, we'll come back to that in a minute. But then something even stranger happens, and it's that God comes to him again at night and tells him to go to meet Balak. It's quite difficult to know exactly what's going on here. We all might have our own views, perhaps. And I think in isolation, this part of the story is a little bit confusing. But thankfully, there are other parts of the Bible that do comment on this story. Sometimes that's good, isn't it? Where the Bible is its own commentary. We sometimes read commentaries and we wonder, is that right or not? But when the Bible is its own commentary, we can trust it. And actually, Peter and Jude both talk about Balaam and specifically his motivation. And this is what they say. Both of them are addressing false teachers in the church. And this is what they say. This is Peter in 2 Peter 2:15. He says, "They have eyes full of adultery, insatiable for sin. They entice unsteady souls. They have hearts trained in greed, accursed children. Forsaking the right way, they have gone astray. They have followed the way of Balaam, the son of Beor, who loved gain from wrongdoing." And then Jude verse 11, says this, talking about the same kind of people. "Woe to them, for they walked in the way of Cain and abandoned themselves for the sake of gain to Balaam's error and perished in Korah's rebellion." That's another story from Numbers, isn't it, that we thought about a few weeks ago. So Peter and Jude both seem to say that the motivation of the false teachers in the church of their day was money, or a love of gain. And then they say that these people, in being like this, are following in the footsteps, or following in the error of Balaam. Now, there's no verse, I don't think, here that you can look at in Numbers 22 and say, well, that's the verse that nails Balaam. But there's lots of little things that would indicate, I think, that he's motivated by greed. Seems to me, at least, that Balaam wanted to go to Balak because he wanted the riches that Balak had promised him. He should have sent those Moabite princes away as soon as they arrived. He should have said, "God has told me not to do this. My hands are tied, go." But he doesn't. He invites them to stay because he wants to know what more, verse 19 says, God has to say. I think he wants God to change his mind. And God, this is my view, not wanting to stand in the way of Balaam following the desires of his heart, speaks to him again and allows him to go to Balak. Now, Paul says in 1 Timothy that the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. Balaam is perhaps just one of many examples in history, and even many examples in the Bible, who sold their soul because of their love of money. And every time the New Testament talks about Balaam, it's always as a warning, and it's often in regard to money. It's his love of money that helps him, or that enables him, to go and involve himself with Balak, something that would sow the seeds of his own destruction. We find out later in Numbers, and again in Joshua, that Balaam is killed with the sword by the people of Israel. That's the end of Balaam. So that's a bit of a fast forward to later in the story. And so Balaam destroys himself by associating with Balak, but his motivation to do that is his love of money. Just think about that for a minute. We often think of God's judgment against the world as something that will happen in the future. And ultimately it will. But the Bible also speaks about God's judgment being revealed presently. And one of the ways it says that it is being revealed presently is that he allows people to follow the desires of their hearts, even if those desires are sinful and destructive for them and to others. In Romans chapter 1, the Apostle Paul describes that in detail. 3 times he says in Romans 1 that God has given people up to impurity, to dishonourable passions, and to a debased mind. And it would seem to me that God gives Balaam up to the things that were most precious to him in his heart, and for him that was the love of money. Balaam wanted to go, and so God gives him up to that desire, even though by doing so he'll bring judgment on himself. Peter actually calls Balaam's actions madness, which is interesting, but that's what it is. It is madness to follow the desires of our hearts in this way, but that's what Balaam does. You know, one of the great things about being a Christian, though, is that God will not give us up to the desires of our heart in that way. Instead, like he did with Israel, we've been thinking about this a number of times, haven't we already? And we'll see this again in Numbers. God disciplines his people with the intention of bringing them back to him. So those who aren't God's people, he gives them up to the desires of their hearts. But those who are his people, he will seek. He will bring them back through discipline. Now, as Hebrews says, that discipline won't always seem pleasant, but it will ultimately produce a wonderful harvest. Anyway, back to Balaam. So we're now going to scene 3 of the story, which starts in verse 22. He starts this journey to Balak, and this is where things get more bizarre. So verse 22 is interesting because it talks about the fact that God is angry with Balaam for going. That's why I think what I've said so far makes the most sense of this. So God is angry with Balaam for going, which is an indication he's been driven by sinful desires rather than by God's word. And he's angry, verse 32 says, because Balaam's way is perverse. Another way of saying that, I think that you might have that in the margin, is reckless. Balaam is being reckless, perverse, or like I said, Peter would say, he's being mad. His love of money, though, has blinded him to his recklessness. Perhaps he thought, Balaam, that what he was doing was okay. God's told me to go. It's absolutely fine. I'm going. You know, again, that's not a million miles away from many people today, is it? They genuinely think the way they're living is okay. But their way might be perverse before the Lord, but they're blind to it. They might even think that, well, God's not stopping you from doing it. It's okay. Anyway, on 3 occasions on this journey, verse 22, 24 and 26, God blocks Balaam's path. Now, many Christians believe this mysterious character, the angel of the Lord, is the pre-incarnate Jesus himself. Now, you see this character, the angel of the Lord, appearing in various places in the Old Testament. And his appearance, I think, shows that what Balaam is doing is serious from God's point of view. But the ultimate irony of this whole saga is the fact that this man, who is called a seer of the gods, can't see the Lord blocking his path, but his donkey can. And she keeps stopping, quite rightly. If there is the angel of the Lord in front of you, sword drawn, you're not going to just keep walking straight, are you? So 3 times she stops. Balaam's not happy about this, and so beats the donkey. And something that almost unbelievably leads to a conversation between the donkey and Balaam. It starts in verse 28. It's a female donkey, so shouldn't be listening for the sort of voice of Eddie Murphy here. And she rebukes Balaam, or as Peter again says in the New Testament, she restrained the prophet's madness. Just take that in for a minute. Isn't it amazing that this man, who seems to have God on speed dial, can't see the spiritual reality of his situation, and yet a donkey can? And the donkey has to explain it to him. You know, it's just a reminder, isn't it, how debilitating spiritual blindness is. And I wonder, actually I was thinking about this, what's the bigger miracle here? Because God opening a donkey's mouth seems quite amazing to us. But I'd like to suggest that God opening the eyes of Balaam is a greater miracle than God opening the mouth of the donkey. And if you think about it, God is doing that miracle even amongst us today, isn't he? God has done that miracle millions of times throughout history. He's opened the eyes of the spiritually blind so they can see. He's still doing that today. But the wonderful thing is that he opens our eyes, not now to see the angel of the Lord standing in front of us with his sword drawn, but to see the Lord Jesus standing in front of us, welcoming us to him. That's lovely, isn't it? Well, as Peter said and Jude highlight, Balaam may be a terrible example, but what he does next is exactly right in verses 31 to 34. He bows down before the Lord, then acknowledges his sin, and he repents. That must be an indication again, mustn't it, that Balaam's original journey was sinful, that his motivation for it was sinful. But it seems as if there's no turning back now. Verse 35. Because God is going to show not just him, not just Balak, but Israel and the wider world about his sovereign plan to bless his people. So the die has been cast now. The journey is halfway through and it's going to take place. Balaam will meet Balak and will end up blessing God's people. But let's just finish thinking about Balaam and then we can talk about this in our groups. Because it is a sobering story. His greed led him into a situation where he found himself in opposition to God's plans and purposes. And even though God turned the tables on him and his sponsor Balak, I think that Balaam by this point was far too far in with the Moabites to back out. You know, later in Numbers 31, Revelation 2 also picks that up, repeats the accusation that Balaam caused the people of Israel to act treacherously against the Lord in the incident of Peor. Now that's a really shocking incident, which we'll think about in a couple of weeks' time, from Numbers 25, when Moab tempted Israel to sexual immorality and idolatry. And the biblical writer tells us that it was Balaam who incited Moab to incite Israel to do that. It seems as if Balaam isn't able to curse Moab, and we'll come to this next time, in the way that Balak wanted him to, but instead Balaam tells Balak how to stumble Israel and how to bring them into idolatry and into sexual immorality. And so he seduces Israel to act treacherously against the Lord. Balaam can't attack them head on, like Balak wanted him to, but he ends up teaching the Moabites how to stumble them. And eventually, as I said earlier, Balaam pays for this with his life. Now I wonder, as he faced death, whether Balaam thought for a second that maybe the second time those Moabite princes knocked on his door, maybe he thought, I should have told them to go away. I should have said, I can't and I'm not going to help you. Instead, he invited them in. He asked God again, and God allows him to go, and that leads eventually to his own destruction. And that's what Peter and Jude urge their New Testament readers to do. They urge them to avoid the error of Balaam, who loved gain from wrongdoing. So even though Balaam is a pagan prophet, Peter and Jude pick him up and they urge Christians not to fall into the same trap as he fell into because of his love for money. That must mean that it's a temptation, or it could be a temptation for us too. But there may be other temptations as well. It may not be money, but it may be things that God allows people to go into because he allows them to follow the desires of their hearts, even if that is destructive. But as I said, the wonderful thing about being a believer, about being a Christian, is that the Lord will never let us do that. He will always come for us. He will discipline us, sometimes painfully, in order to bring us back to him so that we won't fall into that error of Balaam.